welcome to the final episode of this series of the Sky Arts Book Club, and we're going out with a bang. Once again, we've invited a group of avid bookworms to burrow between the pages of two exciting new books, ready to question their authors. I'm Elizabeth Day.
And I'm Andy Oliver. On tonight's show, all the way from Australia, Meg Mason joins us to talk about her Women's Prize shortlisted novel, Sorrow and Bliss, one of the biggest books of the past year. And former soldier-turned-writer Harry Parker will be telling us how he's adapted since his life changed overnight after losing both legs in an IED explosion in Afghanistan.
As always, Simon Savage will be supplying further recommendations throughout the show, won't you, Simon?
I will indeed. Alongside tonight's two brilliant authors, I'll be suggesting some more unmissable books that you might like to curl up with as those autumn nights approach. And this may be the last show of the series, but the conversation continues on the new official Facebook group for the Sky Arts Book Club, where you can also find extra content and further recommendations. Details on how to find it are on the screen now, and we love reading all your posts.
We really do. Now, often dystopian fiction can help people to cope with a stressful reality. So we decided to also talk about books that offer the most terrifying vision of the future, although the present seems dystopian enough to me sometimes.
So true. Time now, though, to meet tonight's guest book club. They're called Appetite, so they already sound like my kind of club. I believe there are normally 70 of them, and they have a waiting list of hundreds. So we're delighted to welcome 5 of their key members, Jo, Rachel, Chris, Ellie and Isaac. So lovely to have you here.
Thank you for having us.
What on earth is your secret? How do you have so many people waiting to join?
Well, the secret is actually the people. People think you go to a book club for the books, but it's all about the people.
And what's the key kind of connecting thought behind Appetite?
Well, the idea is we sit down and discuss a book over a 2-course supper and a glass of wine.
Nice.
But the way it works is we keep moving. So you sit with 3 others and talk about the book, but you move when you get to pudding, and the next month you're with different people.
Oh, so it's like speed book dating.
Yes,
I
so
like
clever.
it.
I'd love to join, but obviously I won't be able to. Let's talk about tonight's first book. In 2009, former soldier Harry Parker's life changed overnight when he lost both legs to an improvised explosive device in Afghanistan. Since then, he has gone on to write an acclaimed novel and now a non-fiction book, Hybrid Humans, that draws on his own experience to discover how cutting-edge scientific developments might affect our identities. Harry will be joining us shortly, but first, we asked him to read a short extract.
Nearly all of the technologies I've learnt to use, and so much of the last 10 years, have been about overcoming my physical impairments. What would it be like to live in a world where disability is normal and truly accepted? Where the attitudes and structures of a society that created the disabled disappear? I am wary of new categories, but I look around for anything that might better describe how I feel. Cyborg and bionic carry too much baggage. They conjure too many fictions and unrealistic expectations. So I've started to think of myself as a hybrid human. It's a label just for me, not one I would impose on others. It isn't perfect, but a combination of 2 different elements seems to fit. And I like that human is part of it. Human, more than anything, is how I want to feel. And it disappears from cyborg, bionic and disabled. This hybrid is a fusion, an amalgam, a confluence of things. Of pig's heart hybridity, of robotics and AI, of genetic engineering and new kinds of interfacing. It feels like a better way of describing my experiences, and is somehow less loaded.
Interesting stuff from Harry there. So what did you guys learn from the book? Chris?
Well, first of all, he writes beautifully, and he could have sort of written the telephone directory, and I would have liked it anyway. I was very surprised, first because it is unexpected. After his first novel, I thought it would go completely in a different way, maybe another novel. This book is so interesting because there's so much information about an issue that I knew very little about. There are conferences, there are meeting places where he goes, and I didn't even know they existed. And that kind of new information is something that I don't know anything about. And so my interest was really piqued.
New worlds, new worlds.
Absolutely.
And the
Well,
statistics too about disability was staggering. I didn't know. The fact about 15 in every 100 worldwide have a disability. Did you know that? Was that new information for you all?
New
Most
information,
definitely.
and the fact that really caught my attention was people aren't born with that. We all kind of think people are born with a disability, but how many come through life and accident? And it could be any of us. And, you know, with any book, you put yourself in that story, and he really does that, I think.
Ellie, did you read? You've read Harry's novel, haven't you?
I have, yeah. So that was one of the first book groups I actually ever attended. I think it might have been the second one I ever went to. And I have to be honest, I would never have picked up Anatomy of a Soldier, his novel. I would never have picked up Hybrid Humans if it weren't for book group. And I have loved them both. I absolutely thought both of them were brilliant. I think partly because they do what books are meant to do. When they took me out of my comfort zone, I don't know anything about what it's like to be at war. I don't know anything about what it's like to be disabled, to suffer some of the sort of struggles that people do day-to-day life. And it, you know, it's completely changed my view already of how things are. Like, I think there's a bit when it talks about the world needing to adapt more for disabled people. And obviously, if you're fully abled, then you can walk around the world and think, oh, well, there's disabled ramps and there's this, but you just don't think about the little things. And I think it's made me much more conscious.
Like a step up,
Yeah.
even making a massive difference. Do you not work with Anatomy of a Soldier?
You teach it, don't you?
I do. So I'm a secondary school teacher. And like I said, it's not a book I would have picked up. And if I'm being really brutally honest, I remember when I was reading it for book group and I read the first chapter or two, and each chapter's told from the point of view of a different inanimate object. And after the second chapter, I thought, oh, this is gimmicky. This is going to irritate me. I'm not going to like it. But actually, I thought it was so clever. By the end, I loved it. So I quite often, when we're looking at narrative perspective and different ways of telling stories, I will read the opening chapter to my classes of different, you know, from 11-year-olds up to 16-year-olds. And it's always one of the most popular bits we do. I think because it's so different to the kinds of things that kids are told is, you know, classic literature. And they, you know, I read it to them. They try and guess what is the object that's telling the story. And it's just, I just think it's such an interesting, different way of telling a story. And, you know, there's quite often a bit of a scramble afterwards for who can borrow the book and go away and read it.
Excellent.
Yeah.
That means it's sparking interest and thought. Isaac, there's an extraordinary level of positivity that Harry displays throughout the whole book, and I just think his whole demeanour. What do you think about that aspect?
I found it quite inspiring, because it's a very... Some of the stuff he talks about, obviously, it can be quite bleak, or I can get very easily, like, have a bad day or just upset about something that's really menial. So it's like, oh, I've got a headache, that's my day ruined. And then you just see how positively he talks about things, even when it was a part of a book where he tried putting himself in another person's shoes by just going about using the one arm and so on. He still had a very positive outlook on it, and I found that just very inspiring, quite a nice way to just look at the situation.
Well, there's so much to talk to Harry about, so let's bring him in. Hello, Harry. Thank you so much for being here. We were all fascinated to read that you don't necessarily see yourself as having suffered from PTSD. I know that there was a woman that you met who thought that you had without really knowing you, but you mentioned something called post-traumatic stress gain.
Yeah, post-traumatic growth.
Growth.
Yeah.
Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so I think it sort of makes sense to us when we start to think about it, but it's just the idea that when something traumatic or difficult happens in our lives, often we can turn it into some sort of positive experience that we then sort of value our life differently and more positively. And I think when you look at someone who's been seriously injured or a soldier who's been to war, there's a tendency to think, oh, have they got post-traumatic stress disorder? But actually, with growth, it can be a sort of natural mechanism of the body to overcome it. And actually, it's probably more common than post-traumatic stress disorder.
So interesting. I know Rachel has something that follows up from that theme.
When you talk about your post-traumatic growth, are there moments where you think, actually, no, I haven't grown nearly as much as I think? Or I always think of post-traumatic stress and post-traumatic growth as the flip side of the same coin. Like, you can't have the growth without having had the experience, which more often than not is traumatic.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And often it's sort of almost how you're feeling that day. You know, obviously with a complex injury, you know, every day is completely different, and sometimes it can be very painful, and sometimes you feel like it's a great day. I think sometimes With PTSD, the problem is it can be it's a diagnosis, a medical diagnosis, it's a physical switch in the brain which is not working correctly. So I think that's sort of where the difference between PTS, post-traumatic stress, which is really natural, we get all the time after car crashes and things like that, but the body manages to get over. It's the D bit, the disorder bit, which is where the brain starts to replay those traumatic experiences. So yeah, I think you're exactly right. You know, some days when I wake up, I put my legs on, they're really painful. That's when it's harder to think, well, would I really not have my legs back if I was offered the chance?
But it's interesting what you're saying, Harry, though, because it seems that what you're saying is that it's nothing static, that it changes all the time, it's completely fluid and completely mobile, and post-traumatic stress disorder feels like it's locked in one place. But actually, when you talk about growth, there's more fluidity and room for all the feelings in some sort of way. Chris, what did you want to ask Harry?
Well, our mother lost her right arm before we were born, so my sister and I didn't know if sort of before and after. So in our eyes, her identity didn't change. But surprisingly, when we asked her, she thought the same. She thought that her identity was exactly the same, and she would have been the same person anyway. In your situation, how your identity has changed? How has it changed?
Well, I think it's a really good question. I can't, you know, I was in the military. I was in a very particular type of environment with a training that makes you into a certain sort of person, I think, at some level. And being injured took me out of that environment. And I think it has changed my personality in some ways. You know, I'm probably living a life that would be so different. You know, I'd probably be, I don't know where I'd be now, but I'd probably still be in the military. And so that it's given me in one sense, it's changed my life completely, but I think it's also because of the injury I've had, it's made me sort of more empathetic and more open to things that I never would have experienced.
Do you think you would have written a book had you not experienced the injury?
Probably not. I don't think so.
We're so grateful because you're a terrific writer. I was saying to you earlier, it's sort of annoying you're good at so many things.
Jo, what did you want to ask Harry?
Well, Harry came to our book club, so this
Jo.
is lovely. Hi, Harry. So lovely to see you.
Shop.
We were thrilled it was this book. So we've read your fiction and your non-fiction, both in personal experience, and both pretty brave to write. Why did you write the non-fiction make-believe bit first, and which is the bravest move?
So I think what's weird about the sort of fiction, so I wrote a book called Anatomy of a Soldier about 5 years ago, and it was sort of, when people talk to me about it, they sort of say, you know, when this happened to you, and I sort of have to say, actually, that never happened. I completely invented that. But I think what's weird when you write non-fiction, and the type of narrative non-fiction that Hybrid Humans is that it's actually far more personal. I'm really laying out myself in a way that in fiction, and because the way I wrote that book, I could sort of hide behind a lot of the sort of, the fiction, the makeup stuff, the stuff I've made up. So I think, in a way it feels a bit more exposing to have written this book. There's much more of me in it and my real sort of deep feelings about things.
Isaac, what did you want to ask?
So I got really intrigued by the more philosophical elements you went into, and what I'm quite curious about is, did you initially go out with that intent to look at the merger between kind of humans and technology and how the physical composition kind of redefines us as who we are?
Yeah, I think I one of the reasons I wanted to write the book was about what it does to us physically. You know, the pain, the fact that when you attach a piece of technology to everyone here, it probably looks like, you know, job done, but actually I'm dealing with sores and rubbing, and it's quite painful. And when I go to the stairs, there's a sort of, oh my God, am I going to fall down these stairs? But then there's also what it does to your personality and your identity. And I think, you know, it makes me sort of, as I said earlier, sort of more empathetic potentially to certain communities and people, and also very aware of how lucky I was, you know, with my upbringing and things like that. And I carry a lot of those privileges into being a disabled person. And I think when I was researching the book, I was very keen on understanding some of the sort of what you might call intersectionality between if you're disabled but also you're a person of colour. You know, how much more that can be a disadvantage. You know, and I was a soldier, so I got given the best kit. I mean, this piece of equipment is from here to here is sort of £60,000.
Wow. Right.
So and not everyone is able to have that access to that equipment, and that's quite weird when you're sitting in an NHS limb fitting centre and there's someone, you know, a girl who's 8 and has had meningitis, and they're not they can't access exactly the same kit, and you're thinking, well, why is that? And it's a sort of, things like that really, I was really interested in exploring.
So it's thrown at all sorts of disparities, to you, like social disparities. It's made you think about all
Yeah,
that
exactly.
stuff.
Yeah, I think so.
Ellie?
So I really enjoyed all of the book, and I thank you, because I found it so interesting. I think, because I'm more normally read literature, enjoyed the use of the line "raging against the dying of the light," taken from the Dylan Thomas poem. And you talk about how you meet all these other people who are doing that, fighting against something bad has happened, and they're trying to turn it into something positive and go and move things on. And you said that you don't do that, and that you just want to live a normal, quiet life. But I wondered if this book is sort of your way of doing that, that you are doing it through writing and raising awareness rather than maybe the medical or technical interventions.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and it did feel important to write it. And I think the reason that I enjoyed writing is I was really discovering as I was going along. But I do think, I do meet people who are they're very motivated, and I wouldn't say angry is probably not the right word, but they sort of set their whole lives up in order to sort of not fight, but to sort of overcome their impairments or their disability. And that's just not my experience. Partly, I think, because actually losing your legs is one of the easier sort of biomechanical problems to solve. Whereas if you lose your arm, it's more difficult. And in a sense, if you lose your eyesight, obviously, if you're visually impaired, that's really difficult to solve. So I was really, I think you're right. I probably am doing a bit of raging myself, but I think it goes up and down as time goes on.
Accepting rage.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing it all with us, Harry, and thank you for coming today.
Thank you for having me.
And Hybrid Humans is available in different formats, including an excellent audio version, which I can attest to because I've been listening to it, read by Harry himself, and it's in your local library. Harry, your book offers some hope for the future, thankfully, but you'll be joining us later to talk about a far bleaker vision. But for now, we welcome back Simon with more recommendations.
I do. I have two more recommendations on disability, one non-fiction and one fiction. And first up, I have Disability Visibility, edited by Alice Wong. And this was started off by the Disability Visibility Project, where Alice really wanted to document all the different first-person experiences of what it's like to be disabled on all sorts of, in all sorts of ways. And she actually, in this, there's 37, but she says she could have easily talked to hundreds of them. And what's amazing with it is how they're documented. So they're all first person, so they come from her, but she's got essays in here, there's poetry, there's transcript from interviews, there's even a eulogy, which is incredibly moving. But it really talks to your book, actually, Harry, because it's all about how everyone's experience is different. It's certainly not a guide to what it's like to be disabled. It's actually very much about what the benefits are of actually having disability, which is a really interesting way of thinking about it and how it changes your life, like writing, for example. But also it looks at the actual really tough moments and how people perceive you in a different way because of your disabilities. Then something very different we have Just by Looking at Him by Ryan O'Connell. And this is all about Elliot, who has cerebral palsy and he's gay, and he has the perfect boyfriend, even down to his anatomy, but he's getting bored of having the perfect boyfriend, even that part of the anatomy. So he's looking for someone else. But what's really interesting with it is it's kind of how, with Elliot as a character, he himself is very different and he masks his difference, and it's how he wants to be perceived as being normal, yet at the same time his perfect boyfriend is no longer perfect, and so it really looks at celebrating imperfections more than anything, and it's hilarious.
That sounds very intriguing. Thank you, Simon. And as always, there's more information on these books, together with loads more original material curated by Simon, on our exciting new Facebook group. Details are on screen now. Coming up after the break, we'll be talking to Meg Mason about one of the most acclaimed books of the last year, her novel, Sorrow and Bliss. See you shortly.
Welcome back. Joining us on the SkyArts Book Club tonight, we have Jo, Rachel, Chris, Ellie and Isaac from Appetite Book Club. They've been devouring Sorrow and Bliss by Meg Mason. This is Meg's second novel, but her first to take off in the UK, and take off it certainly has, having topped the bestseller list and been shortlisted for this year's Women's Prize.
It chronicles the breakdown in the marriage of Patrick and the love of his life, Martha, under the stress of her unidentified mental illness. Meg handles those difficult, often very dark topics with a surprising lightness of touch and sense of humour. Here's an extract we recorded with her earlier.
As we were driving out of London, following our removal truck, Patrick asked me if I would consider making friends in Oxford. Even if I didn't want to and I was only doing it for him, he didn't mind. He just didn't want me to start hating it too soon. He said, at least until we'd unloaded the car. I was in the passenger seat looking for pictures of a drunk Kate Moss on my phone to send to Ingrid because at the time we were communicating primarily by that means. She was 4 weeks pregnant, not intentionally, and she said seeing pap shots of Kate Moss falling out of Annabelle's with her eyes a bit shut was the only way she was getting through the day at this point. I told Patrick I would, although I didn't know how. Maybe not a book club, obviously, but like a book club. He said, you don't have to get a job straight away either if... I said there weren't any jobs anyway. I'd already looked. Well, in that case, it makes sense to focus on the friends thing and maybe you could think about doing something else work-wise if you wanted to, or, I don't know, do a master's. In what? In something. I screenshotted a picture of Kate Moss in a fur coat ashing a cigarette into a hotel topiary and said, I'm thinking of retraining as a prostitute. In the middle of overtaking a van, Patrick shot me a look. OK, first, that term isn't used anymore, and second, you know this house is in a cul-de-sac. There won't be the foot traffic. I went back to my phone.
So, Appetite. This book has been so highly praised, but some people have seen it as a cop-out or even a bit irresponsible that she never names Martha's mental illness. What did you think, Ellie?
I had the same thoughts and I can't decide. I think I'm 50-50 that I think on one level it's probably the most responsible thing to do because unless you are a mental health professional who really knows what you're talking about, I think it would be very risky as an author to think that you could write knowledgeably about that sort of thing in fiction. So I think it's probably the right decision, but I can understand equally as a reader sometimes it feels a bit uncomfortable or a bit strange or a bit frustrating not to know what it is.
I guess also if you're writing from the inside out, if you've experienced things yourself, then it's easier or more successful to be able to explore those topics. But it's a bit of a minefield, I think. What did you feel about the whole thing?
I think it would be very easy to put your own, if one has issues with mental illness or depression or insert here, it would be very easy to cast your own experiences into Martha's. And so I can understand the blank spot. I think where I had issues is just where it became very, not easy for Martha, nothing for Martha is easy, but her experience of navigating, getting to a diagnosis felt very comfortable in a way that I don't think it is for a lot of people, especially navigating the NHS system.
I think that's really interesting. I think going back to what we were talking about with Harry, it's almost like not labelling it is also enabling Martha to be an individual rather than be boxed in.
Yeah, rather than her condition or her illness that she's going through. I mean, I think in some ways not labelling it is quite clever because we then don't bring on board a whole bunch of other supposition that we have about any particular condition that we think, because, you know, we can all be a little bit armchair doctors. I know I think I've got a degree and I definitely don't. You know
I mean, I did my PhD on YouTube. I don't know.
Mine's from ER, maybe.
Mine's from TikTok. But I think we heard there in the reading, there was a slight flavour of the fact that Martha isn't always straightforwardly likeable. Isaac, how did you get on with her as a character?
I quite enjoyed her as a character. I thought she was like quite witty at times and quite fun to read through. But then there are certain times where her relationship to other people becomes quite obscured because of how she's dealing with events or how she doesn't like how other people are treating her with it. And there was a lot of logic behind how she would approach them or approach her thoughts on it. And sometimes you couldn't see that logic, and that's when I found her as a character a bit harder to stay with and keep enjoying because you couldn't really see why she would lash out at certain people.
I think it raises a really interesting subject that people don't really discuss that much, and that is a lot of mental illness and depression, and I'm speaking from the inside out before everybody starts getting worried about it, is that it can make you quite selfish because you see things generally through your own lens most of the time, and that can be so difficult for the people around you. And I know that when I went through the problems that I had in the past, that was definitely something that people around me struggled with. Chris, what do you think about that?
Well, exactly the same. I struggled a little bit with this book, partly because it is so well written and so witty, but Martha is such an unlikable character.
Yeah.
And because she's also an unreliable sort of a narrator, you end up with all the other characters being very sort of unidimensional. And I think that is really unfair towards them. So I'm really on the fence about the book.
Oh, Joe, stand up for Martha.
Well, I am going to, because I didn't find her unlikable. I found her explaining to me what it's like. I have very good mental health, but I am very close with someone who's got very poor mental, or has had poor mental health. And her descriptions, the bit where she suddenly says it's like walking along and someone suddenly pushes you down the stairs. For me, it was like, oh, that is what happens. I see that. And her descriptions, I felt, gave me an understanding of mental health. And I wasn't bothered by the diagnosis, because at no point did we really know what it was, nor did she. So it didn't bother me that they didn't name it. But I found it, as a person looking into mental health, I really took something from it.
So it gave you real insight into what it could possibly feel
highlighter
like.
pen came out and I showed it to a friend.
Oh,
Ultimate
interesting.
compliment.
Well, I think there's so much to discuss. I think it's time to bring Meg in, shall we? Thank you so much for coming. We've got so much to talk about. Let's start with why you chose this subject, Meg.
I feel like the subject chose itself, and I know that it's really annoying when authors sort of say it was all there and organic and it just all came out and I was just channeling, I didn't have to do anything. But I set out to write a love story about a couple who had been together for a really long time, you know, who fell in love as teenagers, and I wanted to show that long relationship sort of to its possible end. But there needed to be something in the middle that had driven them apart, that was sort of outside themselves. It wasn't an affair, it wasn't sort of bad behaviour or just falling out of love. It was something that had been this wedge that had sort of, you know, accreted in a way. And I think that presented itself because it could have just as well been a physical illness, you know, chronic pain would put a toll on a relationship in the same way, but I think it needed to be invisible and it needed to be something that sort of Martha, the protagonist, knows is there, but she can't get that diagnosis. And so the question of the novel can become, what's her, what's him, what's the illness, what's the mystery? And so that seemed to solve that requirement.
You loved the humour in the book, didn't you?
Well, yes, and I want to ask, was that your intention? Did you always think this will have humour to help us with the subject? Or are you just a funny person and it kind of crept in your character?
Imagine if I said, yes, I'm just a funny person. Do you know, I wrote another whole manuscript first that was terrible, and I threw it away. And the reason it was terrible was because I was so adamant that to be literary, which is what I wanted to be, and to be taken seriously and thought of as important, I had to write a really serious, bleak novel. So I spent the entire year trying very hard to make sure that nothing funny got into it, no jokes. And I succeeded, and it was awful, and it wasn't funny. And then sort of through the 6 weeks of mourning that and coming back to it and to start something else, I just was like, why? I just have to do the only thing I can sort of do. And I think it's kind of, I suppose, the way I think. But then once I became more conscious of it, I realised that it did to sort of help readers get through those very dark periods in it. I had to just put something lighter at the end, but also to weave it through, because I think as humans, we're usually at our funniest when we're the lowest, because that's where the gallows humour comes in.
Isaac, what would you like to ask me?
So I noticed with Martha and Patrick's relationship, it's very reminiscent of her parents' relationships, in the sense of that there's just lots of moments of stability and loyalty to one another, but then also there's this sense of kind of denial. And I was just wondering, why were the two so reminiscent? Was it to highlight that stability, or was it to show the more damaging aspects that denial had in that scenario?
I have never noticed that before, the parallel between her parents and her own marriage. That's amazing. I always think of the parallel between Celia, her mother, and the aunt as paralleling Martha and her sister Ingrid. But I suppose if that subconsciously worked its way in, it's because I think you know, once we've grown up and if we had this kind of chaotic childhood that they had and they've sort of survived it, you are adamant that you won't repeat those mistakes and you won't do the same thing while absolutely doing the same thing. And you sort of arrive 20 years later and you think you have turned into her, you know, your own parents and your family. And I think that's what Martha is afraid of, to become her mother. And she talks about, you know, I think at some point she says that's the worst thing Ingrid has ever said to me is you basically turned into mum. But then there's this, the way that the parallel actually comes together and there's some redemption for both of them. But thank you for pointing that out.
Chris, what would you like to ask Meg?
In the era of social media, where people seems to be triggered by almost anything, how much was your portrait of Martha shaped by caution? Just trying to avoid people unpicking your portrait of mental illness.
Yeah, no, it was obviously not a concern for all of those months that I was writing in total secrecy, even from my publisher. And I just wrote with, no concern at all. I wasn't careful. I let Martha say whatever she would want to say in this sort of fury that she's in around what the condition has done to her, but also writing it, I just did anything I wanted with symptoms. And I had a condition kind of vaguely in mind, but I didn't research it. I wasn't, I just was like, oh, she needs to feel this and I'll put that one in and I'll take that one out. So then when it was actually determined that it would be published, that's when I was like, oh my goodness, it's too late now to go back and retroactively make it all medically correct. And I couldn't also make Martha careful herself in the way that she talked about it, because this is her telling and it would be so inauthentic for her. Whereas we wouldn't say, there's something wrong with Martha, which is what she says about herself. She also wouldn't say, as a neuro-non-typical it just wouldn't work. And so that's why I arrived at the idea of when she does get that diagnosis, that it's not named, it's just there's sort of a gap left with, signified with dashes, which also helped creatively because it's meant to be sort of the uncovering of a mystery. And if we'd known it from the blurb, on the back, then we would be ahead of her and we would judge everything she did through the lens of what do we know about this condition? And my sister has it doesn't look like that. And it would become about a mental illness. And I wanted it to be about the lived experience of illness, whichever one it is.
Rachel.
So I wondered if it was deliberate and conscious to have Martha be from this kind of vaguely artistic but solidly middle-class family with all of these opportunities and avenues that crop up just when she needs one.
Yeah.
That she never really has to fall completely into despair until after the diagnosis.
I wanted to explore class within a family rather than without a family, which is what is often done in novels. So I wanted to show what money had done to Celia and her sister Winsome and the way that had created a wedge that Martha and Ingrid had, their wedges around motherhood, and they'd managed to overcome it. It wasn't conscious in that way to sort of give her that cushion. And it's interesting because often you write and it's not till afterwards that, when other people start talking about the book that you see what you've put in. But it's been interesting when there's been this conversation about privilege, and obviously it's there, but at the same time, mental illness it doesn't really care if you have money or not. And obviously she has more access to medical treatment, and her final psychiatrist is obviously a private psychiatrist, so that's, represents a privilege there. But her pain is the same. And I think when people describe her as privileged, I sort of think, but she's ill. Like, she's suffered for 20 years with this chronic illness that has ruined her career and ruined her friendships and her marriage. And so I sort of feel in a way that money is separate,
but it does cushion her though.
It does.
Because other people could possibly be going through the same trials and tribulations.
And she's not going to end up homeless, and she's not going to.
When there's a point for her where she gets to go to Paris and live in a whole apartment. You know what I mean?
But
that doesn't happen to
but you can write different stories, I suppose. You could write the alternative as well next.
Yeah. Yes, possibly. Yeah. I don't know if I don't have the sort of safety net that she has, but at the same time, I wonder how much I'd be entitled to explore it in a different context as an author. I sort of felt like I'd reached the limits of
I think we should all be entitled to explore everything. That's the way I look at it. I don't believe in this. Everybody should stay in the box that they know. Otherwise, how are we ever going to experience each other and the world? Ellie, what would you like to ask me?
So I found it really interesting when you said you didn't set out to write a novel about mental illness, because that was one of the really key things that stood out for me. Especially what I found interesting was the idea that I think she sort of begins to have a really struggle in her teens, and it's not till her 40s that she really comes to terms with it. So you kind of explore the concepts of misdiagnosis, which I think is, and sort of know from not my experience, but relative experience is quite common, because it's not like you can do a blood test and say this is this illness. It's all of the symptoms that overlap. And that was quite a big theme in the book. And then she finally sees a doctor who said it is blank. and gets a prescription, and that seems to be when everything changes for Martha. And as a character, I was so pleased for her, but I wondered if you had any concern that that's a bit simplistic, because after that we never see her go back to a doctor. She has no counselling for the trauma of 20 years of misdiagnosis. She has no medical issues. So I wondered why you chose that once she's got the diagnosis, you know, that's it. She just kind of carries on normally.
Well, there's 20 years before, and if I remember rightly, there's about 8 weeks afterwards that you really look at what that's done to her, and that ability finally for her to say, that was not me, that was me. And I think the focus of the novel, because we've explored so thoroughly her medical experience and the idea of medical misogyny and the way, women are often sort of deemed hysterical, and it's hormones and all of those things, which I think sadly most of us could remember a time if, as women, that we have been disqualified and had our pain minimized. And so I felt like I'd done all of that, and now I wanted to see what that meant for her marriage. And because the question then is it too late? This thing that you've been questing for this entire time, she has it, but what's left? As the house sort of burnt down, what's she going to save? So I think, of course, in a way, as an author, you have to choose what you've got almost time to do. And I think to then show her going to yet another, battery of therapists, we'd sort of been there. And I think, I didn't want to overstay my welcome by 200 extra pages exploring every detail in sort of, true, realistic, that sort of granular. I think we sort of could almost just decide which line.
I was quite relieved when she got her diagnosis, and then when the people around her confronted her about her past behaviour.
Yeah.
Because I didn't really like Martha that much.
I loved her. Who's right? Who's right?
I didn't really like her
word.
that much. So when, I think for me, when she finally was able to be confronted by the people around her, and she became more human.
Yeah, well,
And
she came of age, essentially.
Yes.
That's the ability, because I sort of see her as having this experience when she describes the little bomb going off in her brain at 17. That's when she stopped evolving as a person, and she was completely, ensnared and trapped by this illness that was also sporadic in its manifestation. So people would be able to say, well, you're fine now, so why were you like that last Christmas? That sort of thing. But I also think it's interesting because, thank goodness, I also found her endlessly charming. It wasn't until after the book came out that one of my publishers was like, oh, she's so cruel. And I was like, is she? I didn't...
She's quite mean.
Yeah,
She is
but
quite
also,
mean.
I mean, to sort of look at it almost more seriously, she's ill. And that's what I've been sort of, had that conversation quite often, because I sort of think what I'm trying to say is it was never her. That's what she says. And of course, we can all choose to an extent our behaviour, but at the same time, I think we talk a lot as a society about, oh, it's the same as a physical illness, there's no stigma anymore, we have this open conversation. But I've never heard anyone say, my aunt ruined Christmas again because she just had chemo and kept throwing up. I wish she could just pull herself together. And that's what I've heard said about Martha, and that's been quite a revelation.
I didn't want her to pull herself together, I just wanted her to be kinder.
Yeah.
And I think her illness makes her quite unkind. And we spoke a little bit before you got here about that, about how so many mental illness sort of situations or conditions actually can make you quite unkind or make you quite selfish.
Who's their best self when they're in so
exactly.
much pain? And we meet her at the end of her marriage. So I don't know anyone who's really been a glowing example of sort of kindness and empathy when their whole world is crumbling.
Basically, you're saying that I'm right. Great, thanks very much. Whatever. Meg's book is available in paperback and other formats, as well as in your local library. Meg will be here for the final part of the show to share the book that, for her, presents a particularly alarming view of the future. But first, Simon is back with 2 further recommendations. Simon.
I do. I have 2 more Antipodean recommendations because I don't think we get enough Antipodean literature here. The first of which is Too Much Lip by Melissa Lukashenko, which actually won the Miles Franklin Award in Australia. And when it opens, it's brilliant. We meet Kerry Salter just after she's stolen a motorbike so that she can go back to her hometown and see her family, as there's a death imminently due. And as we go back, we hear the reasons that she left and why she kind of ran away from everything. But we also, when she arrives, start to get all of these family secrets. And I don't know about you, but there's something about a big family drama that is is just so gripping. And what's amazing about this is you get kind of the day-to-day domestic secrets and things, but also, as they are an Indigenous family, you also hear about how they're suffering not just microaggressions, but major aggressions against them at the same time. And what I think Melissa does brilliantly is kind of compare the two and also kind of show where we're all equal, but also it's about a working class family, which doesn't happen very often. And some of them are quite unlikable, but I enjoyed them for that. Now, if we're going to go for unlikable characters, next I have Blue Hour by Sarah Schmidt. And I think if you could describe a book as deliciously toxic, this would be the book for you, because we meet Kitty in the 1970s and she's leaving her husband and she has her daughter Amy in the back of the car. They're leaving in silence. Something clearly awful has been happening there. And then we go to the 1950s and we meet Eleanor, who has just fallen in love with this man who's about to go and fight in the war. She's trained to be a psychiatric nurse, and then he comes back as a patient. And then we find out this toxic motherhood relationship that follows, and it is dark.
Compelling as ever. Brilliant recommendation, Simon. Thank you. Don't forget to head to our packed new Facebook group. Details are on the screen right now for further excellent recommendations from Simon and plenty more original content. Time for another break, but we'll be back shortly.
Welcome back to the SkyArts Book Club. We're joined by Harry Parker, Meg Mason, Appetite Book Club and Simon Savage. Now, surveillance states where every word is monitored, persons being made into unpersons because of their unacceptable views, history being rewritten. Well, it all seemed unthinkable nearly 75 years ago when George Orwell wrote 1984. But it's scary how many of Orwell's predictions have materialised.
With dystopian novels and TV enjoying increasing popularity at the moment, we've asked everyone to choose books that represent particularly terrifying visions of the future, which I very much hope won't be as prescient as 1984. Harry, do you think that part of the reason that people are drawn to these bleak tales is because they offer some kind of catharsis?
Yeah, I think so. And I think often there's more hope in them sometimes. We really latch onto the hope when it's so dark.
So what have you chosen for us?
So I've chosen Cormac McCarthy's The Road, which is it's a really brilliant book. I mean, you know, it's but it's also pretty scary, and there's a great passage where he does sort of suspense, and then they open a latch, and then it's sort of horror story in a book. But I think mainly it's the hope of the relationship between the father and the son, who are going through this sort of post-apocalyptic world.
It is bleak, that book, extremely. Ellie?
I've chosen another really bleak book, Blindness, by Jose Saramago. I'm not totally sure I can pronounce his name right. But it's where there is an epidemic of blindness. So people begin to catch blindness one across the other, and it springs out of nowhere and they don't know why. And it kind of explores how society just collapses and all the structures that we rely on fall apart when something affects so many people. And we see it through the eyes of, excuse the pun, one of the characters who happens to be immune to the blindness. And it's an incredibly difficult read, but it's so gripping and fascinating and horribly quite relevant after the last couple of years, I guess, as well.
Isaac?
So I chose Clara My Son by Kazuo Ishiguro, or Ishiguro even, sorry. And I chose it because it's not the most conventional dystopian book, but due to the fact that if you dissect it, you realise how reminiscent it is of where we've been going since post-lockdown and how the technology isn't too far out of grasp. So it creates quite an uncomfortable look at what could come and things like that.
Love that book. Jo?
I don't like dystopian because I find it terrifying. And this one, I could get on board with Kate Sawyer, The Stranding, because it's a dual timeline. And because it's so set in the now of people and friends and book clubs and lovely things, it allowed me to sort of tiptoe into the future. And it is sad. We don't want the bad future. We want the now. But this is a hopeful book.
Rachel?
I chose The Fifth Child by Doris Lessing, in part because I think there always has to be something that comes before The Handmaid's Tale. And when I read this, it really kind of drove home not only the sheer exhaustion of parenting and how you worry that it's going to go wrong, and as you are having kids older, what could potentially happen, but also the entire social framework is crumbling at the same time, and what is going to happen.
I'd totally forgotten about that novel, and now you've reminded me how terrifying it
Yeah,
was to
it's
read.
super terrifying, and I look at my kids and think, oh, man, I'm in trouble.
Chris?
Well, I've chosen The Kraken Wakes by John Wyndham.
Oh, gosh.
Written in the 50s, but still so actual. There's everything in it, the environment, social tension, but also hope for the future.
Andy, what about you? What have
I've
you
chosen The Handmaid's Tale because it just seemed the most... I mean, we're in it, aren't we, almost? We're on the edge of it right now, and I just think it's one of those things that you read it, you think, no, this could never happen, and we're just, like, literally teetering on the edge of it all over the world. So I just thought it was the best, most relevant one for me to choose.
Chilling TV adaptation
Yeah.
as well. Simon, what about you?
Well, I actually have what has been described as Atwood in the Outback. And this is The Natural Way of Things by Charlotte Wood. And this is terrifying because it's about two women who wake up, they've been drugged, they've had their head shaved, they're in sackcloth, they're in the middle of the outback, and they meet all these other women, and the one thing they all have in common is they have claimed that a very famous white man has done something to them, and now they're all in this one place. It also has one of the most wicked nurses in fiction.
I love a wicked nurse. There's something really delicious about a terrible, evil nurse, isn't there?
Yeah, we're coming to you next, Meg, but I'm doing mine first. So I chose Children of the Dust by Louise Lawrence. It's a children's book. I read it when I was about 8, and I've never forgotten it. And it's about a nuclear war, and these children survive it. And it starts off with a fire alarm, what they think is a fire alarm going off at school, and then they discover that actually Hamburg and I think it's New York, Leningrad, as it was then, have been bombed. And it's just stayed with me ever since because it was just so unbelievably oppressively terrifying. And that's why I've chosen it, because I think often children's books really stay with you, don't you?
Yeah,
Don't they?
but
The power
something
of
that
them.
frightens you when you're 8, you're still scared of it when you're 45, right?
Meg, 43 actually.
Oh, yeah.
No.
I knew she was going to pick up on that.
At Christine reporting. Mine is Weather by Jenny Offal, who I love as the author of my favourite book of all time, which is Department of Speculation. This one is technically, you could sort of say it's about climate change and sort of everything that's happening to our planet, but the way she's done it, instead of sort of looking all the way ahead in that dystopic way, it's right now. It's this very minute. So it follows, it's a mother in her 40s, she's a librarian, she's a husband, she has a son. It's told through a series of tiny vignettes from the daily, the most quotidian experiences that we would all recognise. So she's walking her child to school, but then she will say, you know, with the spectre of climate change looming, she will say, I wonder how far I could carry my child. And you realise that she's sort of thinking the way we are about what is actually next. And, you know, there's a little passage where she's just in her bedroom doing something and there's a bee trapped in the glass between the, you know, a sash window. And she'll sort of talk about bees for 2 lines. And we all sort of know that they're on the verge of extinction, but it's never named. So it just sort of sits there as this prospect. And I think in that way that sometimes you see yourself and your own anxieties in a novel, that's what I felt like. I really related to the mother in it.
Thank you very much, everybody. Really alarming. That is it for this
What
week.
note to
Many
end on.
thanks. Really. Many thanks to Harry Parker, Meg Mason, and of course the Appetite Book Club, and to you at home for watching.
We'll be back with a Christmas special in December, brimming with even more top authors and their fabulous books. Watch this space. Until then, there's plenty to keep you going on our Facebook group. Details on how to find it are on screen now. Don't forget the new title, The SkyArts Book Club, because we love reading your posts and hearing your thoughts.
Bye.
Goodbye.